Whitlam's sacking in 1975 marked the beginning of the end for Australia's economic sovereignty. In the years to follow, under both successive Liberal and Labor governments, the economic policies would serve to force open Australia, as the London and Wall Street financial establishment intended. The commitment to the old Labor tradition of fighting for a sovereign Australia, with control of its own financial system, was replaced with the reheated leftovers of 18th century free trade.
In 1979, a report had been commissioned which became known as the Campbell Report, and it was headed up by Sir Keith Campbell, a top Australian financier who was an Australian associate of one of the very top American financiers very close to the British Crown, Sir Paul Mallon. Keith Campbell's report into financial deregulation recommended that Australia's banking system be deregulated, foreign banks be let into the country, the dollar be floated, those types of measures, which ended up happening. But when they came, these recommendations were seen as so radical under the Malcolm Fraser, John Howard government that John Howard couldn't get any support for them, even though that was a Liberal government, right? The party of big business, etc. That was radical to them. So when Hawke and Keating came to power in 1983, Bob Hawke bragged that they came to power fully intending to implement the Campbell Report. Except they knew that if they just adopted the Conservative government's report, that would have been regarded as very weird by their traditional Labor supporters. So they put up a dummy commission, known as the Martin Inquiry, to look into the financial system and make exactly the same recommendations that the Campbell Report had, and voila, it was their own Labor Party report. This report completely deregulated the Australian economy, and Paul Keating implemented it with gusto. He deregulated the banks. He floated the Australian dollar in 1983, and the dollar collapsed. He opened Australia up to foreign banks for the first time, and as a curiosity, the second foreign bank to be given a bank trading licence in Australia was Hill Samuel, which now today is known as Macquarie Bank. And these reforms by Keating removed all the regulations that had protected the Australian financial system from the worst excesses of globalisation, and had ensured the Australian financial system, to a point, at least functioned to facilitate the physical economy. And that was all torn up. And what it did was allow the kind of looting of the physical economy that characterises monetary systems in general.
Removing the long-term stability of the Bretton Woods system and opening up currencies and financial markets to speculators had one major physical effect: a global collapse of real economic productivity. To make money, new forms of immoral and destructive practices in financial speculation were legalized. The system was once again operating firmly under the control of private central banks, which pumped money into the stock market and into financial paper, while more and more productive industries were being sold off and carved into pieces for financial vultures. By early 1987, the physical economy had already collapsed, and the 1980s speculative stock market and related bubbles were set to pop. Early that year, LaRouche forecast the coming October 1987 crash, issuing a call to urgently shift the policy of the United States to avoid the oncoming economic depression. The crash occurred as he warned, and in the early months of 1988, LaRouche addressed an audience on US national television as part of his presidential campaign, explaining the nature of the 1987 collapse and the economic situation, while providing an insight into his method of physical economy.
Now, imagine we're back in October 1929. I drop this ball. Let's see how that looks on the Wall Street Journal's chart. picture isn't exactly the same, but the general idea is about the same. Now, come back to the middle of October 1987. The ball I'm holding is not the same ball I dropped back in 1929, but it is a similar ball. The same thing happens with this ball in 1987 and 1988 that happened in 1929 and 1930. Why should an economy act like a bouncing ball? Back in Hoover's time and again today. There are physical laws which cause a financial collapse to resemble a bouncing ball whenever a financial collapse is caused by a prolonged contraction of industrial and agricultural production. All of the ordinary rules of market behavior go out the window. Once the crisis begins, the financial markets do not go all the way to the bottom in the first panic. After the first drop, the markets tend to stabilize so that foolish people may believe that a recovery has begun. A few months later, the next drop comes, and then a temporary stabilization at a lower level before the next drop. Now, this is not the place to explain the physical principles involved, but you see the general idea.
The bouncing ball is an illustration of how the economy is constrained by physical processes. What drives the economy is not the financial system that can just be inflated with more money. It's ultimately physical, and the bouncing ball shows with each successive bounce, it shows the energy leaving the system, and at a certain point the energy will entirely leave the system and you've got a dead flat economy.
With the banks of Australia and the world bankrupt in 1987, having accumulated huge unpayable debts as a consequence of their speculation, LaRouche continued to outline the steps for a return to real economic development. Forecasting a collapse of the Soviet Union in the coming months, and a slide into the worst depression of the century, LaRouche called for nations around the world to use the historic moment to rebuild, returning to the tradition of scientific and technological progress. Meanwhile, the incoming US Federal Reserve Chairman, Alan Greenspan, had other plans.
Alan Greenspan became chairman of the Federal Reserve, and he began deploying an economic policy which he'd call bubbles. He deliberately inflated credit bubbles, speculative bubbles in the economy, as a way of propping up the economy. He used government agencies in America, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, to buy the bad debts off the American banks and take them onto these government agencies. And then in order to handle those, they securitized them, like mortgage-backed securities today, bundled up these bad debts and sold them on to investors. And this began what we call the mother of all bubbles, the derivatives bubble, which at that time measured about $1 trillion. From 1993, Lyndon LaRouche was warning about how insane derivatives were, because in a sense, derivatives represented how far world economic policy had gone from what he'd called for back in 1987. Right, a total bankruptcy reorganisation, so everything would be put back on a sound physical economic footing.
The legalization and massive spread of securities and derivatives during the early 1990s confirmed LaRouche's 1970s warnings once again. The world financial system had now arrived at the era of hyperinflation.
The CEC produced our own warnings about derivatives from 1994, and we printed graphs showing the holdings of derivatives by our own banks, and they were already massively exposed to derivatives back then, right? And so we could see where this was going, because the world had veered sharply towards wasn't even just a system based on debt and monetarism per se, but the most crazy speculative instruments which can only be likened to gambler's side bets.
In 1994, LaRouche issued his ninth long-range forecast that the financial markets would enter a disintegration process in the near term, where the only means of delaying an inevitable death of the post-1971 system would be hyperinflation. However, the United States didn't walk down the pathway of folly alone, The Labor and Liberal parties in Australia, acting under the direction of first Keating and then Howard, were in lockstep with Greenspan all the way to the cliff edge of July 2007 and even beyond.